Good afternoon. My name is Shane Vega, the Director of Product Management with Userful. And today we're going to be talking about building out command and control centers in today's modern technology landscape. So part of the agenda today is going to be to talk through the evolution of AV over IP, some deployment challenges in today's converged world of AV and IP, infrastructure considerations, workflow considerations, and your total cost of ownership considerations. So if we go back several years, most of us are probably familiar with a world where everything was analog. The type of specialized cabling that was needed to support that, type of endpoints, and just the difficulties that were centered around deploying large-scale, complex video distribution systems. Now, as we begin to move through into maybe over the last decade and a half, we'll call it, we've begun to have a convergence of AV and IT. And you've probably heard this term a lot, right? The convergence of AV and IT. And what we've learned is that AV over IP is here to stay. We're kind of well beyond the convergence of AV over IP or AV and IT, and we are now, dead smack into an industry where the Internet of Things has taken full hold of how design methodologies are developed, how solutions are designed, and essentially, specifically, as we're talking about command and control centers, how do we begin to incorporate the various complex nature of IT infrastructure and the Internet of Things into a world where people are still very familiar, very comfortable with kind of the old way of doing things, if you will. And I'll get into a little bit more about what I mean when I say that, because obviously, while we are in a very much network-centric industry right now, while the convergence of AV and IT has been fully established, there's still very much a comfort level in kind of doing things as it's always been done, right? But you'll see here one of the quotes that I have from the AV network. It does talk about how the AV over IP is one of the most impactful trends of 2020. And a large part of that has to do with the pandemic and the way that it impacted the way we were all forced to do business, right? So essentially what we're talking about here in this slide is just the graduation from the analog sunset, where we finally have put to bed all things that are supported by an analog world, into the AV-IT convergence, and then ultimately into a true AV over IP infrastructure. And so this might be familiar to some of you guys who are looking at this. Back when things were all analog, you'll see this traditional AV solution where you've got your matrix switchers, which are defined by a number of inputs and a number of outputs. You've got your sources and you've got your destinations. All of these things are connected through specialized AV cables. And the scalability and the subsequent flexibility is limited by the nature of that design. And so when we move into the AV and IT convergence, really what was accomplished was a bit of a hybrid scenario, where now instead of these limited matrix switchers, we can now begin to incorporate things like IT networks, network switches and the like, where instead of using transmit and receive boxes, we're using encoders and decoders, very similar in nature, but they're all IP addressable. Problem with this model is that in today's world, people are accomplishing this through a means of proprietary hardware. And so while it does fit within the confines of an IP network solution or an AV over IP solution, we can think of this as more of an AV over IP ready solution. And that's what you begin to see. A lot of manufacturers out there are designing their systems around an AV over IP ready solution. And again, I'll talk about that in a moment as to why that is. And it ties back to my original point about, people are comfortable with the idea of hardware, specifically proprietary hardware. But in this AV and IT hybrid model, you'll see that there's network switches involved, encoders and decoders, but it still requires a very separate network infrastructure to support that. And then they'll take a hook and they'll put it into your corporate LAN so that you can have some outbound connectivity to it. And then you go, what we're showing here is what I would consider a true AV over IP solution, and really the core of where a userful solution truly shines, right? And so in this type of a solution, your sources and your destinations. And by sources, it could be anything that either is a hardwired source that needs to be encoded or a network source that we can pull directly into our solution. And then by destinations, we're talking about various different display types or even audio devices. But all of these things are routed directly to the network. You'll notice that in this diagram, there are no proprietary boxes. There's no real hardware of any kind outside of the server infrastructure. And important to note is that with the Userful solution, the server infrastructure is non-proprietary in nature. And we can support on-premise, in the cloud, and data center solutions. So this is where we really begin to lead the way in terms of where the industry is going, based on that AV over IP infrastructure, based on the AV over IP methodology. And this is where you get the most out of your scalability and flexibility, and where you really begin to see advantages that are currently in place in the way that we communicate. Right now, I'm talking to you through a recorded Zoom webinar where I'm sharing content. I've got my video going. All of these things are being accomplished with no proprietary hardware whatsoever. Everything that you see nowadays in today's very remote world that we're living in, we can accomplish distribution of both audio and video over existing network infrastructure. And this is a very important part. I want to double back on a previous point that I made regarding the previous hybrid solution. And even before that, the traditional AV solution. If you think about how the world has evolved, there's still a discomfort with things that are new, right? People are used to hardware, matrix switchers, very specialized cables interconnecting various AV endpoints. And so to move from that into a hybrid solution, not a big jump. People are comfortable again with the idea of hardware because they know it's just always worked. However, there are significant limitations in the way that you can reach true scalability and flexibility when you're reliant on hardware endpoints that are proprietary in nature. The true way to get flexibility and scalability in any environment, most specifically in a command and control center, is to be able to take full use of network infrastructure and, more importantly, network protocols that allow you to send content over an existing network. So this kind of gives you a very brief snapshot of what a Userful solution does, right? Whether it's a mission critical command and control center, whether you're in a meeting room, or if you've got a retail store even somewhere, it doesn't matter the application. Userful is essentially the central server that allows us to aggregate a lot of information over the network and then disseminate that data to the proper endpoints through our Userful video networking platform, right? And you'll see that the note that I put here at the bottom says, ultimately the key to a successful AV-IT convergence project is to view it as a business process and not just technology. And this is where I think the rubber really meets the road. When you're talking about mission critical command centers, one of the most critical things is response times. We'll talk about this a little bit later. When we think about response times, those are tied to workflows, standard operating procedures, emergency response plans. If the solution that you have deployed isn't as flexible as your business process or your workflows, you're ultimately going to be stuck in a situation where you're being reactive instead of proactive. So what are the challenges? Well, again, as we just said, in mission critical operations, details matter. Response times matter. Improving situational awareness really matters. And I think these have become rather cliche in the way that we speak about them. When we talk about situational awareness, we think about it as just making somebody aware. But I believe the real critical differentiation between just the way the world typically talks about situational awareness and maybe the true situational awareness is that situational awareness should be proactive, not reactive. Making someone aware of a situation after the fact doesn't really do anybody a whole lot of good, right? And so part of the challenge is, how do you get information into the hands of the key stakeholders or critical personnel fast enough where they can respond quickly and be proactive in ensuring that they mitigate risk, whether that risk is financial, whether that risk has to do with human life. Regardless of the scenario, you want to be ensured that you are provided with the highest level of situational awareness. We also want to make sure that some of these challenges that we're addressing have to do with the holistic approach and planning, making sure that we're not just talking about a fancy video wall and maybe some matrix switches, but that we're actually taking into consideration that workflow and how it's going to be impacted. What type of trends might change the way that you utilize technology in the future? Are you going to purchase something today that leaves you in a position where you can't fully expand your business needs 3 to 5 years from now? Or worse yet, potentially end up with something that's obsolete or outdated 2 to 3 years after you get it because it's based on proprietary hardware from a manufacturer that no longer supports it. The whole purpose of today's webinar or today's presentation is just to get everybody thinking in a way of what's practical in planning and how you can plan early so that you can sleep well at night later, right? So here's a classic example of, let me get my screen out of the way because I think it might be recording over that. So here's a classic example of what you might see in a traditional, environment where you have complex signal routing. And more often than not, some of the most complex signal routings that I've seen happen within a command center. Okay. One of the things that I've noted here is that in the Pro AV industry, you've got about $50 billion of middleware and infrastructure that's being sold into these spaces. And you'll notice that to create a solution that's flexible enough to ingest sources from a wide variety of applications, typically you'll see everything from encoders, decoders, control systems, CMS edge servers, content delivery networks, thin clients, all of which are proprietary in nature, all tied together through specialized AV networks. This is only going to cause extreme complexity in the way that you manage and maintain. It's going to increase prices for integration and maintenance, sometimes by 2 times because of the complexity. You're going to be stuck with what we call proprietary hardware lock-in, right? So once you've made a decision on a particular manufacturer, you're kind of stuck with that manufacturer until you either have a new budget to replace or find someone that's better. That's probably one of the biggest issues that I've seen as I go to this next slide is that, when you think about $50 billion of Pro AV hardware and middleware and infrastructure, that's all being deployed on somebody's network, right? And so one more thing I'd like to note before we move on is that when you deploy that much hardware that's proprietary in nature in an environment that's utilizing a network infrastructure, your IT department very rarely will have access or visibility into that hardware, which creates further liabilities and risk when it comes to security compliance because you don't have visibility and management from an IT level, from an infrastructure and operations IT level. It's very difficult for those folks to be able to manage boxes when they're proprietary and managed by a third party. You have to rely at that point on the manufacturer or the integrator to ensure those boxes are up to date with the latest and greatest security protocols. So it does create a bit of a liability with that as well. So this is how Userful solves that problem. We don't utilize, critical proprietary hardware. We don't put boxes on your network that you can't manage. In fact, every piece of hardware that would be needed to comprise a Userful solution is completely non-proprietary, and we give the IT department full autonomy over the management of those boxes. In fact, in many, if not all cases, we would encourage the IT departments or the end users to purchase that hardware themselves so that we can just provide the software infrastructure to support it. Userful's video networking platform is software defined. This is important because by being a software defined platform, that gives us the ability to utilize existing network infrastructure and existing network protocols for the distribution of content, the distribution of sources to destinations. So you see in this graph here, there's not a whole lot, if any, middleware. You have your Userful server that's going to be running on standard off-the-shelf servers that you can get either from Dell, HP, Lenovo, it doesn't matter to us. And then we rely upon industry standards like WebRTC, HLS, RTSP, ONVIF, and we can actually extract sources directly from the stream of that video to incorporate that into the Userful solution for the distribution of that content onto a video wall in your command center. And then we provide you that software to help manage that video as well, whether it's customized layouts, click and drag, soft KVM functionality, which is very important in a command center. So all of the typical features that you would expect to have when actually using the interface are all going to be there to help you manage your day-to-day operations. But the real benefit is that this gives you the flexibility to send this content to anybody who has access and credentials to the network that you subscribe to. So this means remote at-home workers, key stakeholders in other parts of your organization, other parts of that building. They might not even be in the same geographical location, but if they have access and authority onto the network by which you subscribe, you can then send this content to anywhere you want. It's not limited to just the four walls of the operations center. This gives you a much more enhanced experience when it comes to how you develop and comprise your emergency response plans. Because now you're no longer talking about the operators receiving information and having to verbally communicate that to someone. They can physically send this video confirmation or video data to other people within the organization, or even external stakeholders like first responders that might need this information to help them with their response. So this just further highlights the flexibility of a Userful platform, right? This is, Userful allows you to deploy and manage the content across your entire screen infrastructure. So if you think about a command and control center, more often than not, you're going to have a video wall. Sometimes you may have a video wall and some disparate displays. In other cases, you may just have quite a few large format displays. I've seen them of all shapes and sizes. You may have additional conference rooms that are used for what we call war rooms, right? Where when a situation arises, you can bring some key stakeholders into a room and you could begin to navigate through that response. Userful allows anyone to stream any source to any display in any location in real time. This is a very powerful and very compelling use case that currently nobody in the market can do. Certainly not without the use of significant amount of infrastructure and proprietary hardware. So we talked a little bit before about the importance of workflow discovery, and I want to talk a little bit more about that here. Oftentimes people approach the development of a control room around technology and technology alone, right? They'll come up with a budget and they'll say, I've got a room that is X feet long by X feet wide and X feet high. How big of a video wall can I get? How many operators can I squeeze into that space? And what type of infrastructure do I need to install to make sure that I can send content to that video wall? And that's usually the extent of the entire list of questions that you might get asked before you get a traditional bill of materials or a rough order of magnitude pricing from somebody. Very rarely have I seen people really dig into workflow discovery. How do you intend for this system to work for you? What do you intend for this system to do? And more importantly, what are the key pieces of information that you need access to help you make those critical business decisions? More importantly, who is involved in the decision-making process? Because I could almost guarantee you that most of the people who are involved won't even be in that room. The people in that room are the operators who receive the data, they translate the data, and then they have to communicate that to somebody. And more often than not, that's reactive in nature. So understanding your workflow, understanding your daily business operations plans, understanding your emergency response plans, and then really coming up with a detailed plan about who are the key people that need this information, where do these people currently reside, and then what is it going to take to ensure that they have access to the information are very critical questions that are very difficult to answer when you're limited by proprietary hardware and separate AV networks, right? The other key detail when you're talking about workflow discovery is bringing in your IT folks early in the conversation. Every organization is different. What I have seen time and time again is that the facilities folks or the people who are using the space in that operations center are involved in the conversations very early on and throughout a whole, maybe half the way through the design process. And then they engage the IT department, mostly because the IT department is who's funding this. That's 9 out of 10 times I see this where the IT department has the funds, and so they have to sign off on the solution, making sure that it fits the budget, and B, you're not going to do anything that goes against or violates their IT processes, security processes. What I have seen is that when you bring the IT staff in the front end of this conversation, and you begin to talk through security considerations, when you begin to talk through network infrastructure considerations, bandwidth constraints, and you really begin to understand how to ensure the technology is going to be deployed in a way that makes it easy for everybody to use, and more importantly, that you're giving power back to the IT department by giving them visibility into what's going to be on their network, that opens up a much more comprehensive discussion that leads to a much better outcome. Some other questions that you might want to ask yourself during this workflow discovery is, where do things need to be visualized? Is it just in that room? Is it in some other key stakeholders' offices? Do you have folks who are working from home? Do you have other geographical locations that need to be working in an active environment, sharing information back and forth? And then ultimately, what are you trying to accomplish? Right? I asked that at the beginning of this slide. If you don't go into the planning phase with a clear goal outlined for the end result, it's going to be very difficult to ensure that you have a satisfied solution at the end, or a solution that leaves you satisfied at the end of this whole process. Finally, I want to talk a bit about total cost of ownership. This is a big one because people make decisions on technology largely in part because of cost. But they usually just consider the upfront cost, because more often than not, we're talking about CapEx expenses, not OpEx. The OpEx is just the maintenance. You get a big chunk of money for your capital expenses to spend on a new refresh, and that's the money that you want to use when you're going into a new build out like an operations center. But when you consider the total cost of ownership, this sheds a much different light on your technology discussions and your technology choices. Because as we mentioned earlier, when you think about a proprietary solution that utilizes a ton of hardware that you're going to put into your organization, that hardware has to be refreshed. So understanding your budget life cycle is important, because then you can begin to come up with an accurate total cost of ownership comparison. Is your budget life cycle 3 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Every organization is going to be different, but by understanding when your budget cycle is, that will give you a better glimpse into how you should spend your money in the short term, right? And I can tell you, it doesn't really matter what your budget life cycle is. I don't know that I could ever make an argument for purchasing proprietary hardware and having that lead to a positive total cost of ownership analysis. And the reason for that is you're going to be higher in cost right from the get-go, because you're going to have to purchase all this additional hardware that you wouldn't need for a software-defined solution like Userful. That hardware is going to have to be maintained. Your maintenance costs are going to go through the roof. The hardware also needs to be refreshed. And this is a big one, because hardware needs to be refreshed usually 3 to 5 years. Where I've seen most budgets on an operations center typically need 7 to 10 years before they want to refresh an operations center, because of the amount of investment that you're putting in this center. So when you think about just that one point, hardware versus software, it really begins to paint a clearer picture of how do you want to begin to work through the design implications of your solution. The other thing to consider is just keeping up with the firmware updates, break fixes. The amount of power that you're going to need to drive all these devices is a big one. Extra hardware means extra power. It means extra heat. This means your electrical costs are going to be higher. Your HVAC requirements for your rack and for the room that you're going to be working in are both going to be higher, because hardware gives off BTUs. So now you're going to need to compensate that with a better HVAC system. The security updates, alignments, failures, the amount of training that takes place because of the hardware failing and how to talk through troubleshooting. And, as you have turnover, this training needs to be constant. And all of these things add to costs, whether it be for maintenance or whether it be for equipment failures or what have you. We talked about vendor lock-in in a previous slide, right? When you make a decision to have a manufacturer deliver you proprietary hardware, you're kind of locked in, at least for your budget cycle. one of the big, one of the, probably the most frustrating things that I've seen in working on the other side of the line. For those of you who don't know me, I spent the better part of a decade working for a global systems integrator. And in doing so, I had the chance to work with virtually everybody in the industry. And so I've kind of seen it all when it comes to these types of deployments. One of the most frustrating things that I've experienced is when you deploy a solution that's proprietary in nature from a company that doesn't have a transparent roadmap. What I mean by that is they'll sell you whatever their current version of hardware is without making you aware that they're already in the process of working on their next best thing. And I've been in situations where end users have just cut the ribbon on a brand new operations center just for the manufacturer to release that latest and greatest new piece of hardware, which renders the new solution that we just put into this place obsolete. That new solution is now already on an end of life list that will stop being supported in 3 years. There's nothing more frustrating than spending countless dollars of your organization's money to build out a command center just to be told weeks or months later that system has now been flagged as obsolete and is end of life. This is a huge issue for manufacturers who are in the proprietary hardware business. In contrast, because Userful deploys a software-defined system, and because Userful deploys this software-defined solution in a way that is a subscription as a software as a service through subscriptions, this means that A, you refresh your hardware in your organization based on your own schedules that you already have in place. IT will already have a schedule for replacing hardware, and you can follow that schedule. There's no other schedules to follow. As far as the software is concerned, because we're in the business of software, you will always have the latest and greatest software by the nature of being part of our subscription. So every time a new firmware release comes out, every time we release a new feature update, you'll have access to that. You'll never have to worry about being in a situation where your solution is obsolete. In fact, your solution will only get better with time. And this is a key differential between a software-defined solution like Userful and a proprietary hardware-defined solution, which represents pretty much everybody else in the industry. With that, I would like to make you guys aware that we do have what we like to call our Operations Center Control Room Planning Checklist. It covers off some of the points that I mentioned in this presentation now, but it also goes a little bit deeper into some other considerations that you might want to think about, help you avoid pitfalls, think about the way that you want to develop a design and a solution that will proactively help you with your situational awareness, and also will be designed with future-proof methodologies in mind, meaning that we don't want to put you in a situation where you're designing around technologies that will be archaic 3 to 5 years from now. Being a software-defined solution affords us the benefit of making sure that when we deliver a solution, that we're always staying 2 steps ahead of the industry, always making sure that we're adopting industry best practices, and always making sure that our customers have best-in-breed solutions for their enterprise and for their command center. I mentioned a non-transparent roadmap in my previous slide when we were talking about total cost of ownership. One more point that I would like to make is that I represent product management. I'd be happy to talk through the roadmap for Userful with anybody who'd like to have that conversation. And this is a very key point about Userful and how we partner, because we don't begin and end our journey in the control room. Userful is a platform, a video networking platform. As I mentioned before, it's any source to any destination. So for the purposes of this presentation, that destination has been control rooms. But that destination might be a conference room. That destination might be a whole different application. We might be talking about digital signage. Userful has software to help support digital signage needs. We can even help you create your own content if you'd like. The benefit of having interconnected apps with a single platform for the distribution of that content, that now begins to afford you the flexibility of reaching a wider number of people as a part of your emergency mass notification. If you think about an operator in a command center who has a situation that requires alerting a large group of people, if you're able to access screens that are outside the command center as part of your communication protocols, Well, now you can give strategic messaging and send emergency mass notification messages to whichever screen you have access to as part of the Userful network. So this is just one more important thing to keep in mind, and I apologize for not covering that earlier. This is probably the wrong slide to touch on that, but nevertheless, I wanted to make sure that I spoke on it before we close this meeting out. So having said that, I'll turn it over to you guys for questions. I'm sure Eli will be more than happy to help you. And unfortunately, while I might not be able to make the meeting for the live Q&A, please know that I am available. If any questions arise, you can either contact Eli, get in touch with me directly. He can share my contact information with you guys. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your partnership. And good luck with the rest of your presentations. Take care.